My name is Natalie Brooks, and I used to believe every family loved their children equally until I grew old enough to understand that some homes, quietly, choose favorites while the others learn to survive on forgotten promises. The happiest day of my life became the beginning of my greatest heartbreak, because the people who should have celebrated my future instead treated my unborn child like an obstacle that needed to disappear. I spent my childhood in a quiet neighborhood outside Asheville, North Carolina, where my parents built their entire world around my younger sister Emma, while I learned to celebrate every achievement without expecting applause or affection from anyone at home. If she earned average grades, they rewarded her with gifts and praise, but when I worked tirelessly for every success, they simply nodded before shifting the conversation back to whatever Emma wanted or needed that day. Instead of allowing bitterness to define my future, I focused on building a peaceful life with the people who truly valued me, and that journey eventually led me to my husband, Ryan Carter, a hard-working home renovation contractor whose calm personality made every difficult day easier to survive. We dreamed of becoming parents from the beginning of our marriage, but after nearly 3 years of disappointing doctor visits, failed treatments, and countless tears, we quietly prepared ourselves for the possibility that our dream might never come true. One rainy afternoon, while driving home after another medical appointment, I stopped at a small pharmacy because something inside me whispered that I should take one more pregnancy test before giving up hope completely, and only a few minutes later I found myself staring at two unmistakable lines that changed my entire world. My hands trembled so badly that I had to sit on a nearby bench outside the store while tears streamed down my face, realizing that the miracle Ryan and I had prayed for during so many sleepless nights had finally arrived when we least expected it. Ryan was repairing kitchen cabinets when I rushed through our front door with the tiny test hidden behind my back, and the moment I placed it into his hands, he looked at me with disbelief before pulling me into an emotional embrace that neither of us wanted to end because every painful disappointment suddenly felt worthwhile. We spent the rest of that evening talking about baby names, decorating a nursery, and imagining family traditions we wanted to create together, completely unaware that sharing our wonderful news with my parents would soon expose a painful truth that had been quietly growing inside our family for decades. The following Sunday, I carefully wrapped a tiny pair of white baby shoes inside an elegant gift box and drove with Ryan to my parents' house, convinced that becoming grandparents would finally melt the emotional distance they had always kept between me. I imagined smiles, warm hugs, and joyful tears filling the living room, never realizing that I was walking into a moment that would permanently change the way I viewed the people who had raised me. When we arrived, everything looked perfectly ordinary as my father relaxed in his favorite chair reading the newspaper while my mother prepared lunch in the kitchen, and Emma sat comfortably on the sofa talking excitedly about a weekend shopping trip she had planned with friends. The familiar atmosphere briefly eased my nerves, making me believe that perhaps this visit would become one of those treasured family memories we would laugh about for years to come. After everyone gathered around the dining table, I slid the gift box toward my mother and asked her to open it before explaining anything, watching her curious expression slowly change as she lifted the tiny shoes into the air and struggled to understand their meaning. I smiled through nervous tears before quietly announcing that Ryan and I were expecting our first child, but instead of hearing congratulations, the room became so silent that even the ticking clock on the wall suddenly sounded painfully loud. My mother slowly placed the baby shoes back into the box without saying a single kind word, while my father folded his newspaper with an expression that felt strangely distant rather than surprised, and I immediately sensed that something was terribly wrong. Before I could ask what everyone was thinking, my mother looked toward Emma instead of me, and softly asked whether she was prepared to hear this news, as though my pregnancy somehow required my younger sister's approval before anyone else could react. Emma lowered her eyes for several long seconds before quietly admitting that she never expected me to become a mother. Before she did, explaining that our parents had always convinced her she would be the first to give them a grandchild because that was simply how they imagined the future unfolding. Although her words caught me off guard, I could also hear uncertainty in her voice instead of anger, making me realize that she was repeating expectations planted in her heart over many years rather than speaking from genuine jealousy. My mother suddenly pushed her chair away from the table with enough force to make it crash against the wall, and the calm expression she had been forcing onto her face disappeared beneath an explosion of anger that left everyone in the room completely speechless. She accused me of stealing the future she had always imagined for Emma, insisting that I should have waited until my younger sister was married because, in her mind, becoming the first parent in the family somehow belonged to Emma alone. I stared at her in disbelief, convinced that she had to be speaking out of temporary frustration because no reasonable parent could possibly expect a married daughter to delay starting her own family for someone who was neither engaged nor planning to have children anytime soon. Ryan stepped closer and calmly reminded everyone that our pregnancy was a blessing we had prayed for during years of disappointment, but his respectful words only seemed to make my mother even more furious than before. Without warning, she stormed across the room and shoved me so hard that I stumbled backward into the edge of a cabinet, instinctively wrapping both arms around my stomach while terror rushed through every part of my body because protecting my baby became my only thought. Ryan immediately caught me before I could fall, placing himself between us while demanding that no one come any closer, yet my father remained frozen in his chair with his eyes fixed on the floor as though witnessing violence against his own daughter required no response at all. Emma suddenly burst into tears and begged our mother to stop, admitting that she had never wanted anything terrible to happen and confessing that she had simply repeated the ideas she had heard throughout her childhood, without realizing how deeply they had poisoned her thinking. My mother refused to listen, continuing to blame me for destroying the perfect family story she had imagined for years, while Ryan gently guided me toward the front door, refusing to let the argument place me or our unborn child in any greater danger. The drive home felt endless because neither Ryan nor I could find the strength to speak, and I spent the entire journey staring out the window while replaying every painful word in my mind, until they all blended into one overwhelming feeling of betrayal. After we reached home, Ryan held me tightly as I finally allowed myself to cry without holding anything back, and through those tears I realized that the family I had spent my entire life trying to earn love from had chosen their fantasy over my happiness once again. For the next several days, my phone remained almost completely silent except for a few messages from coworkers asking how I was feeling, and the absence of concern from my parents hurt more deeply than the argument itself because it felt like they had erased me from their lives overnight. Ryan stayed close to me, whenever he could, making tea, attending every appointment, and reminding me that our home was filled with the kind of love our child would actually remember long after the noise of that terrible afternoon faded away. Late one Thursday evening, while we were finishing dinner in the quiet glow of the kitchen lights, the doorbell rang unexpectedly and Ryan walked to the front entrance with a cautious expression that immediately made my heart begin racing. Again, a moment later, he called my name in a voice filled with surprise, and when I stepped into the hallway, I found an elderly woman standing beside him with silver hair, a polished wooden cane, and eyes that somehow looked both fierce and compassionate at the same time. She introduced herself as Margaret Bennett, my father's estranged aunt whom I had not seen since childhood, explaining that Emma had contacted her after the confrontation because she could no longer carry the guilt of what had happened inside that dining room. Margaret spoke gently but directly, telling me that favoritism had divided our family for generations and that she had spent years hoping someone would finally break the cycle before another child grew up, believing love had to be earned through competition. 2 days later, Ryan and I followed Margaret to my parents' home, and although every step toward the front porch felt heavier than the last, I knew this conversation would determine whether my child would ever know the people standing behind that door as loving grandparents or distant strangers. Emma had already arrived before us, and when my parents opened the door and saw all of us standing together, their confident expressions disappeared because they immediately understood that the truth they had been avoiding was finally waiting for them. Margaret remained calm as she described exactly how years of favoritism had poisoned our family, explaining that children who constantly compete for love eventually grow into adults carrying invisible scars that last far longer than anyone realizes. My father lowered his head in silence while my mother struggled to defend her actions, but every excuse collapsed under the weight of one simple question when Margaret quietly asked whether protecting one daughter's feelings could ever justify placing another daughter and her unborn child in danger. I looked directly at my parents and spoke more peacefully than I ever thought possible, telling them that my daughter would never grow up believing affection had to be earned by being first, being perfect, or being someone else's favorite because real love has room for everyone. I explained that forgiveness could only begin after genuine accountability, and until they accepted responsibility for the pain they had caused, Ryan and I would keep our distance to protect the peaceful life we were building for our growing family. Several months later, I welcomed a beautiful and perfectly healthy baby girl into the world, and the first people waiting outside the delivery room were Ryan, Margaret, and Emma, whose joyful tears reflected the healing our family had slowly begun to experience after so many years of division. My parents eventually reached out with sincere apologies and a willingness to change, and although rebuilding trust has taken patience and healthy boundaries, I have learned that protecting my child will always come before preserving old family traditions that were built on unfairness instead of unconditional love. As I hold my daughter today, I no longer measure my worth by the approval I once chased because she has already taught me that the greatest gift a parent can give is a home where every child feels equally valued, respected, and deeply loved from the very beginning. Please subscribe to our channel and share this video with your friends and family. We create entertaining and inspiring stories for our viewers, and your support helps us continue making great content for you.